When you picture the Islamic Golden Age, what comes to mind? Likely, it's images of grand libraries in Baghdad, revolutionary advancements in science and mathematics, brilliant philosophers, and exquisite art. History books rightly celebrate these towering achievements. But what if there was a brutal, unsung shadow to this golden era? What if the rapid expansion of these same caliphates, lauded for their cultural flourishing, concealed practices so systematically cruel they make European medieval warfare look merciful by comparison? You're about to discover a side of Islamic conquest rarely spoken of, drawn not from the accounts of their enemies, but from historical sources written by Arab chroniclers themselves. These weren't random acts of violence, they were calculated, systematic policies of conquest, designed not just to occupy lands, but to shatter the spirit of entire civilizations and erase them from history. From the systematic theft of children to create loyal slave armies, to the deliberate destruction of ancient cultures, Islamic caliphates perfected methods of conquest that went far beyond mere military might. They understood that true domination meant breaking the will of the conquered, ensuring their perpetual subjugation. And among their most terrifying innovations was a system so insidious, it was literally a blood tax. The Devşirme, a tax in human flesh. Imagine living in fear of the knock on your door, not from a tax collector demanding silver, but demanding your son. This was the terrifying reality for Christian families in the Balkans under the Ottoman Empire, an empire that created one of history's most systematic child trafficking operations, deceptively disguised as a tax collection system. It was called the Devşirme, or the blood tax. Every few years, Ottoman officials, often accompanied by Janissary soldiers, ironically themselves products of this very system, would sweep through Christian villages. Their grim task, to select boys between the ages of 8 and 18, chosen not for their family's wealth, but for their physical strength, intelligence, and even their appearance. Parents were forced to watch, helpless, as their children were identified, singled out and taken away. They knew, with a soul-crushing certainty, they would never see them again. Resistance meant not just death for the chosen child, but for the entire family, often the entire village. Once collected, these stolen boys were subjected to an unimaginable psychological and physical ordeal. They were transported, often on forced marches, to Istanbul, the heart of the Ottoman Empire. Upon arrival, their baptismal names, their native languages, their family histories, everything that defined them, began a systematic process of eradication. They were forcibly converted to Islam and plunged into intensive military training, specifically designed to erase their previous identities. Forbidden from speaking their native languages, forbidden from contacting their families, forbidden from practicing their original religion, every facet of their past was stripped away. The most promising, the strongest and brightest, were molded into Janissaries, the Sultan's elite infantry corps, a fighting force renowned for its ferocity and unwavering loyalty. The psychological manipulation was sophisticated, relentless, and truly brutal. These boys were constantly indoctrinated with the narrative that their Christian families had abandoned them, while the benevolent Sultan had saved them from ignorance and savagery. They were given new names, new histories, and, most crucially, new loyalties. Loyalties that transcended blood or former nation. Many genuinely came to believe they owed everything to the Ottoman system that had in fact enslaved them. The sheer scale of this blood tax was staggering. Historical records suggest that between 1365 and 1826, when the system was finally abolished, an estimated 500,000 to 1 million Christian boys were forcibly taken from their families. Entire regions of the Balkans lived in constant terror of the next collection, their communities perpetually scarred by the loss of their young. But here lies one of the cruelest ironies of the Devşirme. These stolen children, these former Christians, often became the primary force used to conquer more Christian lands. They were deployed to destroy the very communities they had once belonged to, creating a self-perpetuating, horrific cycle of conquest, forced conversion, and ethnic cleansing. The Devşirme wasn't merely about creating soldiers. It was a calculated strategy for breaking the spirit of Christian communities. By systematically taking their strongest and brightest sons and turning them into enemies, the Ottomans ensured that any widespread resistance would become both practically and psychologically impossible. Desperate families devised desperate strategies to protect their children. Some would deliberately injure their sons to make them physically unsuitable for selection, disfiguring them to save them from a fate worse than death. Others would hide them in remote areas during collection periods, hoping to evade the meticulous Ottoman officials. But the system was notoriously thorough, and once identified, few children escaped. While the infamous transatlantic slave trade lasted roughly 400 years, the Islamic slave trade operated for an astonishingly longer period, over 1400 years from the 7th century until the early 20th century. Conservative estimates suggest that 11 to 17 million Africans were enslaved and transported to Islamic lands, but the true number was likely far, far higher given the duration and scope. But the Islamic slave trade differed from the Atlantic trade in one crucial and horrifying way that makes it uniquely brutal: systematic castration. Between 80 and 90% of male slaves destined for Islamic markets were castrated. This gruesome procedure was performed either before transport in crude, unsanitary conditions or upon arrival in the Caliphate. The mortality rate from this surgery was staggering, approximately 90%. This means that for the vast majority, being chosen as a male slave for these markets was, in essence, a death sentence. The castration centers of the Islamic world were industrial-scale operations. The main center in Aswan, Egypt, for example, is documented to have processed thousands of boys and men annually. Those who miraculously survived the procedure became eunuchs. Forever marked, permanently mutilated, they were considered less than human, incapable of reproduction, serving specific roles within the caliphates. This wasn't accidental or a byproduct of chaotic trade. It was a deliberate, calculated policy. Islamic law permitted slavery, but also encouraged the freeing of slaves, particularly those who converted to Islam. By preventing male slaves from reproducing, Islamic societies ensured a constant demand for new captives from outside, avoiding the perceived complications of a large, permanent, self-sustaining slave population that might eventually demand rights or pose a threat. It was a strategy to maintain control and a perpetual disposable labor force. Female slaves faced a different, but equally brutal fate. The most attractive were often selected for harems and concubinage, becoming sexual property to be used and discarded as they aged or fell from favor. Others were relegated to grueling domestic labor. Unlike in the Americas, where slave families could sometimes form and even reproduce, Islamic slavery, through policies like male castration and the constant influx of new female captives, was largely designed to prevent the development of stable, long-term slave communities, which could potentially foster rebellion or a shared identity. The Mamluk system took this to an extreme. Young boys, primarily from the Caucasus and Central Asia, were purchased as slaves, forcibly converted to Islam, and rigorously trained as elite warriors. These Mamluks eventually became so powerful that they overthrew their masters and ruled Egypt and Syria for over 250 years. Yet, in a chilling testament to the ingrained nature of the system, they themselves maintained it, continuously importing new slave soldiers rather than allowing their own children to inherit power. The economic impact on the source regions of these slave raids was devastating. Entire areas of Africa were depopulated, their demographic structures shattered. The constant warfare required to capture slaves destroyed local economies and utterly prevented any form of sustainable development. Some regions never recovered from centuries of this systematic human trafficking. Even more disturbingly, contemporary Arab chroniclers like Al-Tabari and Ibn Battuta wrote matter-of-factly about slave markets and castration procedures, treating them as normal aspects of economic life. The sheer scale and systematic nature of these operations were considered utterly unremarkable by contemporary Islamic writers, revealing a deeply ingrained societal acceptance of these cruelties. Beyond the horrors of physical enslavement, Islamic caliphates developed chillingly sophisticated systems for destroying other religions and cultures, all while maintaining a veneer of plausible deniability about outright forced conversion. They achieved this primarily through the dhimmi system, a legal framework that made non-conversion economically and socially unsustainable. Central to this was the jizya, or poll tax, levied exclusively on non-Muslims. This tax was deliberately set at levels that would bankrupt most families. In many regions, the jizya was equivalent to several months' income, making it impossible for all but the wealthiest to pay. But it wasn't just about the money. The collection process itself was meticulously designed to be humiliating. Dhimmis had to present themselves publicly, often being struck, forced to kneel, or even having the payment snatched from their hands, a constant reminder of their subjugated status. But taxation was just one tool in this arsenal of religious destruction. The systematic dismantling of religious infrastructure was equally, if not more, devastating. When Arabs conquered Egypt in 641 AD, they began a centuries-long campaign of destroying Coptic monasteries and churches. These weren't just religious buildings, they were vibrant centers of learning that contained the last remnants of ancient Egyptian knowledge, language, and culture. Their eradication meant the slow death of a millennia-old civilization. The conquest of Persia saw a similar calculated destruction. Zoroastrian fire temples, some of which had burned continuously for over 1,000 years, ancient flames tended by generations of priests, were systematically extinguished. Zoroastrian sacred texts were burned, and priests were executed or forced to convert. Within a few centuries, a religion that had dominated the Persian Empire for over a millennium was reduced to a tiny persecuted minority. Perhaps the most extreme example of this calculated religious destruction comes from Mahmud of Ghazna's campaigns in India between 1000 and 1027 AD. His own chroniclers boast that he destroyed over 50,000 Hindu temples and forced millions to convert at sword point. The famous Somnath temple, one of Hinduism's holiest sites, was not just demolished. Its fragments were deliberately used to build steps for a mosque, turning a revered sanctuary into a symbol of utter subjugation. This destruction wasn't random vandalism. It was calculated psychological warfare. By annihilating the physical symbols of other religions, Islamic conquerors aimed to demonstrate the perceived powerlessness of other gods and the absolute supremacy of Islam. Forced conversions often took place in the desolate ruins of destroyed temples, reinforcing this brutal message of Islamic dominance. Beyond physical destruction, legal restrictions made practicing other religions increasingly difficult. Christians and Jews were forbidden from building new churches or synagogues, ringing bells, or conducting public processions. They couldn't testify against Muslims in court, carry weapons, or ride horses. These restrictions created a system of legal apartheid that slowly but surely transformed non-Muslims into second-class citizens in their own ancestral lands. The cumulative effect was devastating. Ancient Christian communities in North Africa, which had produced brilliant theologians like St. Augustine, disappeared almost entirely. The once thriving Zoroastrian population of Persia, numbering in the millions, was reduced to fewer than 200,000 worldwide today. Entire religious traditions that had existed for millennia were systematically erased from their homelands, leaving behind only echoes of what once was. Beyond the systematic enslavement of men and the eradication of faiths, Islamic Caliphates also institutionalized sexual slavery on a scale that truly dwarfed most other historical examples. The infamous harem system was far more than just about the pleasure of rulers. It was a calculated, systematic method of breaking conquered peoples through the sexual exploitation of their women. Consider the Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid, celebrated in the tales of Arabian Nights. He maintained a harem of over 2,000 women. These were not willing participants. They were captured women from across the vast Islamic world, kept as sexual property, and often discarded when they aged or fell from favor. When Baghdad tragically fell to the Mongols in 1258, the last Abbasid caliph's harem alone reportedly contained over 700 women. Contemporary accounts from that horrifying period describe the systematic rape and murder of these women as the city burned, bringing a brutal end to centuries of institutionalized sexual slavery in the Abbasid capital. The concubinage system created a pervasive legal framework for this sexual exploitation. Concubines had virtually no rights. They could be bought, sold, or given away like any other piece of property. Their children were largely considered illegitimate and had no inheritance rights unless specifically acknowledged by their fathers, a rare occurrence that perpetuated their precarious status. Slave markets throughout the Islamic world specialized in the sale of women for sexual purposes. The famed traveler Ibn Battuta himself described markets in Cairo, Damascus, and Baghdad, where women were displayed naked for inspection by potential buyers. The most attractive commanded prices equivalent to several years' wages for skilled workers. The psychological impact on families was devastating. Parents knew that attractive daughters faced a high and constant risk of being captured and sold into this brutal sexual slavery. Some families resorted to desperate measures, deliberately scarring their daughters' faces to make them less desirable to slave raiders. Others kept daughters hidden indoors, often leading to a culture of female seclusion that tragically persists in some regions even today. This system created a perpetual and relentless demand for new captives. Unlike wives, who retained their status throughout their lives, concubines were frequently replaced as they aged, meaning slave raids specifically targeted young women, utterly devastating the demographic structure of conquered regions. The scale of this sexual slavery was enormous. The Ottoman Empire alone is estimated to have enslaved over 1.5 million women for sexual purposes between the 14th and 19th centuries, drawn from the Balkans, the Caucasus, Africa, and Central Asia. And this was all underpinned by religious justification. Quranic verses, such as those referring to "those whom your right hand possesses," were interpreted by religious scholars to permit unlimited sexual access to female slaves. Elaborate legal frameworks were developed to regulate the buying, selling, and use of sex slaves, all while maintaining that the system was divinely sanctioned. The impact on conquered communities was profound and long-lasting. The systematic removal of young women disrupted family formation, cultural transmission, and left demographic scars that many communities never fully recovered from. Beyond military might and the horrors of sexual slavery, Islamic Caliphates employed a brutal strategy of economic warfare to completely dismantle conquered societies. Their goal wasn't just to extract wealth, but to obliterate economic independence and force utter reliance on Islamic rule. A key weapon was the kharaj, a land tax set at devastating levels, often consuming 50 to 80% of agricultural output. Farmers were left with almost nothing. If they couldn't pay, their ancestral lands were ruthlessly confiscated and given to Muslim settlers, effectively severing their ties to their livelihood and independence. In Persia, sophisticated Sasanian irrigation systems, vital for agriculture, were deliberately destroyed, not just neglected. This was a calculated policy to prevent any economic recovery. Tribute demands weren't just for goods, they included quotas of people. The Nubians were forced to provide hundreds of slaves annually, and the Bulgars had to supply young men for military service. These human tributes devastated local populations, providing a constant supply of forced labor while simultaneously weakening the conquered. Trade restrictions further cemented this economic apartheid, limiting non-Muslims' commerce and imposing additional taxes, gradually funneling economic control to Muslim merchants and systematically impoverishing non-Muslim communities. The result? Regions that had flourished for centuries became economic backwaters, their resistance made impossible and conversion incentivized by sheer desperation. But the assault went even deeper. Islamic Caliphates unleashed a final devastating tool, the systematic erasure of cultures and identities, a cultural genocide so thorough that entire civilizations simply vanished. Libraries and centers of learning, like the famed Library of Alexandria and Persian royal libraries in Ctesiphon, were deliberately destroyed, severing people from their intellectual past. Language suppression was ruthlessly enforced, with Arabic imposed as the sole language of administration, education, and religion. Local languages, like ancient Egyptian Coptic, were marginalized and ultimately silenced in daily use, effectively breaking the chain of cultural transmission for future generations. The very landscape was rewritten. Ancient cities, regions, and geographical features with millennia of history were renamed with Arabic alternatives, a deliberate act of historical erasure. Religious festivals like Persian Nowruz and various Hindu festivals were systematically banned, and local customs were declared un-Islamic and eliminated. Pre-Islamic monuments and architectural heritage, temples, palaces, were either demolished or forcibly converted into mosques, sending an unmistakable message. The past was worthless, and only Islamic culture held value. Educational systems were completely restructured, with traditional schools closed and replaced by madrasas, teaching only Islamic subjects, ensuring younger generations grew up ignorant of their own heritage. The results were devastating and permanent. Ancient Egyptian civilization, resilient through Persian, Greek, and Roman conquests, was completely erased within centuries of Arab conquest. Zoroastrian Persia was reduced to a mere shadow. Entire chapters of human history were ripped out, leaving gaping voids we are still discovering through archaeology. This wasn't random violence or misunderstanding, these were calculated policies, meticulously designed to utterly break the spirit of conquered peoples and ensure perpetual domination. The combination of relentless military conquest, suffocating economic warfare, deliberate cultural destruction, and systematic enslavement created an absolute system of control. Understanding these uncomfortable historical practices helps us recognize enduring patterns of cultural destruction that tragically continue today. The methods may change, but the goal remains the same: the complete erasure of alternative ways of life and the forceful imposition of a single dominant culture. It's a sobering reminder that history's shadows hold lessons we can never afford to forget.